Will the federal government's anti trolling legislation really drive them offline?
What does the Productivity Commission have to say about our right to repair?
And how will your car decide that you're too drunk to drive? Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award winning network and Australian based support. Hey there, welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading tech journos to dive into the big stories of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined as always by Alex Kibnan. Alex, we're talking about cars, knowing that you're too drunk to drive. Which other gadgets do you think should cut us off when we've had a few too many?
Look, it's fairly simple, fairly basic. The fridge. You've had a few too many to drink. You think, oh, I'm really hungry. And that's the point where you eat the regrettable stuff in the fridge.
Yeah.
And I think people who've had a few too many to drink know what I'm talking about.
So a little breath testing on the handle, and it goes, I'm sorry, cutting you off.
Exactly. Go have some glasses of water, lie down, think about what you've done.
Speaking about people who should have a lie down and think about what they've done, we're also joined once again in the virtual Vertical Hold studios by a longtime friend of the show, Dr. Nick Healey from ABC Radio Western Plains. Dr. Nick, welcome back to the show.
It is fantastic to be back. It is lovely.
Now, which gadget or service needs to turn you away when you're on the source?
Look, before I get myself in trouble here, I just want to say that I have never dated in the age of dating apps, but I can imagine that dating apps should absolutely shut down if they detect that you are too drunk to be operating them.
If you can't swipe right with a straight finger, you're too
It should be
drunk.
all over, all over.
That sounds like very responsible tech right there. Now, this time of year, sometimes it gets a bit quiet for tech news, but as usual, 2021 had something different in mind. Dr. Nick's in the studio to chat smart cars that can detect when you've had a few too many. But first, there's been some big legislative shifts in the tech world this week, stuff that affects all of us. We caught up with Choice's Erin Turner a few weeks back to talk about the Productivity Commission's right to repair inquiry. We thought there was a report coming early next year, but they've actually dropped it this week. So we'll be chatting to Erin about what that means for Aussies wanting a fair go when they need their tech gadgets repaired or replaced. First up, though, the federal government's also pushing for legislation that would take on online trolls and specifically make it easier, at least in theory, for everyday people to get real world details about trolls for defamation cases. We caught up with Emily Nagel from Monash University to talk about where the legislation lies and whether or not it could actually be a silver bullet for fighting trolls.
So, the government recently proposed new legislation to deal with, as they say, online trolling. And as it always seems to be, this is fairly controversial stuff. We're joined by Dr. Emily Nagel from Monash University to discuss where this legislation kind of hits home and where it might not. We've been here before, though, haven't we, Dr. Nagel?
We have. We actually see this proposed solution come up again and again. It's like a cycle, I think, as our collective concern about online harassment, trolling, abuse intensifies. Of course, people want to do something about it. But simply banning anonymity is not the right answer here.
And when we say we're banning anonymity, this is to my reading, this is a very narrowly defined bit of legislation because whilst there's talk about banning, online trolling and abuse, which we can all agree it's not a good thing, it shouldn't be there. This is really specifically talking about defamation and getting the identity of anonymous accounts online. And I know you've done a lot of research into this. Is it as big is the anonymity problem within online abuse as big as people think it is?
I feel like the problem is the abuse and the harassment, right? Anonymity is a really fundamental part of our digital spaces and our social media platforms. And if we concentrate on anonymous trolling and harassment that goes on and we put those two things together, we're missing a bigger picture because people use anonymity to access all kinds of conversations and connections that are really valuable and useful. So simply suggesting anonymity is the same thing as trolling, and so to get rid of one immediately gets rid of the other, that's oversimplifying.
But just to make sure I understand this correctly, they don't want to ban anonymity and force me to say what my real name is in every online interaction, do they? They just want to create the situation where if someone needs to, they can unmask my anonymity and find out who I am. But it's not going to force me to put my name as Adam Turner on everything that I use, is it?
Not yet, but
Not yes. Good point.
I think that the government would absolutely love it if every single person, at least in Australia, was compelled to hand over, those sensitive legal identification documents and link that to a social media account, basically for surveillance purposes. That would be something the government would really like. What they're proposing now, though, you're quite right, is that it should be easier to connect a social media complaint with a formal legal system in which you can sue somebody for defamation.
We've seen a lot of issues with social media platforms, and I'm thinking here really specifically of Facebook, but they're not the only ones, where giving them a lot of our personal information is not the best idea for our own privacy, safety, and security. This would sort of force our hands, though, wouldn't it? Or the tone of the legislation seems to suggest the idea that we might have to hand over more information for those accounts so that Facebook could meet the Australian legislative requirements.
Yeah, and platforms like Twitter, where people are not currently required to use their real name, or it's not even part of their kind of policies for users. It certainly this would be connected with people. It's about normalizing people submitting those identity documents to platforms, which I think it raises alarm bells in a lot of context because I don't think that people trust big tech corporations
I wonder
at the
why.
at the moment, given their recent and not so recent history of using and abusing people's identity information. And I also think that there is some well placed skepticism that the government will treat that identity information with the care and respect it deserves.
So they're talking about this as trolling legislation, but from what you're saying, it looks like it only applies in a case of defamation. So if I'm online and I'm being a jerk, but I'm not actually defaming somebody, then this doesn't kick in, does it?
No, so it's very interesting that there's no suggestion here from the government that platforms should do a better job of things like content moderation
Mm.
or a complaints process. They're not suggesting that platforms should instigate more robust blocking tools. For example, when you block somebody on Twitter, why aren't you blocking an IP address or a whole device instead of just one account so that somebody can't just log back in and continue, being harassing or abusing? Or abusing somebody. So, really, it's not trolling legislation, it's defamation legislation. It's trying to give a smoother process to suing somebody in those really formal and official legal channels.
And traditionally, defamation is basically the tool of the powerful. So it's basically handing more power to those people who have the money and perhaps influence to throw around their weight and defamation laws, but not necessarily helping those who are vulnerable to online trolling, but not necessarily in a position to sue someone for defamation.
That's completely right. This comes just after Peter Dutton has sued a refugee activist for calling him a rape apologist on Twitter. This is a very recent case that certainly speaks to those dynamics of power
Hmm.
and who has the access to these sorts of legal solutions to um, I guess let's call it an argument on Twitter, right?
And I mean, if I'm reading the act correctly as well, I'm not a lawyer. If that wasn't obvious, the the act actually says that in the first instance, the social media companies can only hand over details if the person consents. So if I defame you and you say, right, I want Alex's details, the social media company comes to me and says, oh, Emily wants your details because you've defamed her. In what sane universe am I going to say, yeah, sure, have all my details? Please sue me. How does
And
this make sense?
It, it's a very good question. I mean, I think that what the government would really like to see here, and again, this is, I think, coming from an earlier plan they had to simply compel all Australians to submit identity documents to platforms when they sign up. Because then they would have this information on hand, ready to become evidence and a point of connection with that kind of defamation process. So there's yeah, that's a very interesting kind of thing to suggest, like, well, this new legislation is about compelling people to hand over their identity information as long as they're okay with that. And I
Yeah, because
just I just can't see that scenario.
I think if they say no, you've then got to go to, I think it's the High Court. I could be wrong there, which is presumably not an inexpensive process. We're back into the rich and powerful category, aren't we?
Yeah, we certainly are. I mean, if a defamation case is brought, then it gives that legal process some extra powers to do that work of identifying um, the person who is supposedly being defaming or trolling, which are not the same thing.
Hmm. We've also got the Online Safety Act coming in. I think it's early next year, which handles a lot of this material in a similar sort of way, but under the purview of the e-safety commissioner. Um, do we need this additional legislation when there's already a compulsion for removing content and potentially for identifying individuals, albeit the safety commissioner has to agree that that has to be done?
I think it does, give it at least gives a sense that people are really starting to prioritize safety online. I think the whole idea of having an e-safety commissioner and having this kind of attention paid to harassment, to trolling, to people feeling right unsafe. It's in the name. This is what the idea of that position is supposed to get across. But some of the way that they're approaching this, I think, is open for criticism. There's again that kind of sense that safety comes from being connected with official identity channels, with formal legal requirements, and that's not what makes everybody feel safe.
And I think if you looked at some of the most abusive people online, they are high profile people who are very happy to put their name to what they've got to say. They are perhaps journalists or politicians who like to go and cause trouble because they've got deep pockets if anybody wants to give them a hard time. Forcing them to use their real name is not actually going to change that, is it? Because they're happy to.
Exactly. I mean, we've had recently, Yasmin Abdel Majid come out and suggest that she knows exactly what it's like to be abused and harassed on social media. And she says almost everybody who has abused her on social media did so using their real names. They are happy to go on record. They're happy to be quoted in the media. Sometimes they're the ones writing the stories. She is suggesting anonymity is not what protects bullies. Power is what protects bullies. And so this is really just uh, entrenching those kinds of power dynamics and giving even more recourse to the people who already have the means to pursue legal solutions to this kind of harassment and abuse that, yeah, maybe they're dealing out and maybe they're taking in some cases.
What do you think would be a better way to approach it?
I mean, I do think that if there are, if this is understood as a problem, okay, we know that a lot of, especially marginalized and underrepresented communities suffer from disproportionate levels of harassment and abuse. We see a lot of stories coming out from, from women, from Indigenous Australians, from people of color who is suggesting that this is a real threat to the way that they can operate in these online spaces. So, what's going to make them feel safer if it's not simply forcing real name policies and identity verification on platforms? I feel like if we understand that that's a problem, and I think we do, because we're talking about it more and more, shouldn't there be more resources in terms of who gets to access these spaces and how? What sort of controls do users have within and indeed outside of the platform to make sure they're hearing from the people who they would like to hear from and that they're able to be themselves in public, but they're not on the receiving end of so much harassment that it makes the platforms feel dangerous or unusable. So, I'm talking about having properly resourced moderation teams, not simply content moderation that's outsourced and delivered, globally as sort of piecemeal, underpaid, casual work, but dedicated teams who are resourced to bring a maybe a local perspective, who are equipped to deal with this kind of stuff by making sure that people aren't able to simply create account after account and come back into these spaces and to keep targeting the same people.
Yeah, that content moderation thing is really important. I've seen a lot of discussion around one of the implications of this particular bill being I forget the name of the case, but the recent case which pushed the onus onto media publishers for Facebook comments, I think it was, and this then flips it back to the social media companies themselves. It seems like nobody wants to do content moderation.
You're right. And the reason that no one wants to do content moderation is because content moderation is expensive when you do it right. It costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of time. And the studies that people, especially in the United States, are doing recently would suggest that the people who are doing content moderation, this is a job that is rarely properly built into a company's staff. It's actually much more likely to be outsourced to, underpaid and contract workers in the Philippines, for example. And when those workers are under a lot of stress and pressure, not even taking the various sort of cultural dynamics into play, they're not able to give each individual case the time and the energy that it needs to actually come up with a solution that's going to help the person who's facing this kind of targeted harassment.
And I guess the issue there for a lot of these tech companies is that they would then tend to lean on computational AI led solutions, but you then end up in that kind of classic territory where you know I share a recipe for chicken breast meals on Facebook, and suddenly they're saying, "Well, no, hang on, you said the word breast, naughty, you're out."
Yeah, you're right about that. I mean, once we start automating what harassment and abuse looks like, there's so many examples of that just grabbing out the wrong things, as you're saying. There's no suggestion of people joking around with each other, people saying things sarcastically. Tone is really hard for automated systems to read. There's also the idea that some categories of speech, like simply talking about queer and LGBTI issues, might be easy to flag, but it doesn't actually take into consideration what those conversations might actually be about. They could be really helpful. They could be sex positive. They could be about health. But if certain phrases, words, even emoji sometimes are considered a bit naughty, if they're simply deleted, that's not fixing a harassment problem. That's just punishing people for using particular phrases.
Okay, thanks so much for your time, Emily. Now, if people want to converse about this with you on social media or find you on the web, where can they do that?
They can find things I've written about this issue and other things about social media as well at my website, which is emvdn.net.
So, a few weeks ago, we had Erin Turner from Choice on the show to talk about what's happening with the right to repair. And apparently, a lot's happening with the right to repair. So, she's back again. Erin, welcome back to the show.
Hello, thank you.
Erin, why have we called upon your services so soon?
There is a giant, beautiful, long report. It just dropped this week from the Productivity Commission. It's a full roadmap of how Australia could have a well functioning right to repair.
So, this sounds a bit too good to be true. Are you pinching yourself at this point? You sound excited.
I am excited. Look, it's a really well thought out process. The Productivity Commission has thought through a lot of different angles. It has almost everything I was hoping to see in it. And it's a whole series of reforms a willing government could pick up.
A
And that's
willing
probably the
government.
the grey cloud in this discussion is a report is only good if a government implements it.
So, whilst I'm sure that the whole report makes thrilling bedtime reading for those that are inclined that way, what are the kind of headline features? What are the big things that it's recommending that we get under a right to repair? And I suppose for those keeping along at home, what is a right to repair?
Well, what is a right to repair was a conceptual conversation the Productivity Commission ran into, and it depends how you view it. In the US, it's like we just want manuals and the ability to repair products. In the EU, it's a bit more about we want products that last well. We want to buy things and have a circular economy. What this is delivered is is a bit of both, and I think that's why it works so well. It's got recommendations around making our law more effective because we do have a right to repair under Australian consumer law. It's just really hard to enforce. There are recommendations around competition and intellectual property, so things like how do independent repairers get the things they need. And then there's recommendations around sustainability and getting product information at the point of sale so you can find things that will last.
Now, to me, that's the big question, things that will last, because
Mm.
they're talking about putting basically use by dates on products or determining the usability of a product. Now, I expect that when I go to buy milk. I don't expect it to when I buy a MacBook Pro. How does that going to work?
Look, it's going to be more complex than the process for milk, I suspect. Choice actually outlined a process that we think can be undertaken to develop this. And you've really got to go product category by product category and figure out I mean, this is what we do every day. We figure out what factors should go into a durability rating and what should be considered in terms of repairability. And they can be things like there are some durability testing methods that are coming out of Europe where they literally put a washing machine under extreme stress and run it till it dies. It's very cool. But there's also other things you can do. You can do tear downs, check parts, replaceability, are things glued together? Are things likely to wear down very quickly? And then there's all these practical things you can test. For example, from our data, we know that with fridges, one of the things that's most likely to break is your shelf. So, do companies keep those parts and can people access them quickly? You can build a ranking system taking all that data.
And this was part of the what I've looked at for the overview of the report that I found really interesting in this is it's not you're right. Absolutely, those are things that factor into durability. But this whole best before dates thing is also meant to encompass things like software updates and actual support for the product. So your next iPhone might have a, best before 2025 label on it in theory.
In theory. And look, I guess unlike the milk example, this will be a minimum rather than a floor, not a
Hmm.
ceiling. So the software recommendation is great. It's specifically saying that software updates are so essential to a product; they have to be considered as part of a product. So if you have to service a product with software for a reasonable period, that'll depend on the product. And if it stops working, well, then you might have a chance to get a remedy, like a refund or a replacement.
But often a product reaches end of life because it stops getting software updates.
That's it. Well, this I think is really challenging that approach. So either getting manufacturers to commit and let people know at the point of purchase it's dead in 5 years,
Hmm.
and people will or won't buy that, or getting them to adjust their practices so they do serve it for longer. It's not a perfect world, but it does use those market demand pressures to try to get companies to at least be explicit and ideally do better.
I'm going to say it if it's implemented. There is still this big dangling
Big
if
if.
that as a big win, especially for things like smartphones, because
Mm,
quite often it's a field I cover a lot, and I see in retail stores really, really old handsets, and I just look at them, and they're still boxed, they're still being sold as new, but I look at them and I just go,
yeah.
yeah, you're already a couple of versions out of date. You're probably never seeing another security update. You might be functional in the sense of you can run this, but you probably shouldn't do your internet banking on it.
Oh, I think this is where I like the explicit part of this recommendation. Um, I can think of a lot of groups of consumers, my grandparents, for example, who aren't going to be as aware of the cybersecurity issues. And, they'll buy a phone that's functional, but they may not realize the risk that comes with it. So we really do want that better information at the point of sale saying, this thing hasn't been serviced for the last 3 years. It's probably unsafe. Don't use it.
Maybe not so much with high end electronics, but more with traditional appliances and cars and fridges. I think it's fair to say that they don't build things to last anymore. They used to make things to last 50 years, but now it's their business model to realize that, well, it's not worth spending the extra money to make it that long. A, because people won't want to keep it for 50 years, but also we want them to buy another one in 5 years. If they're making it to last the warranty in a bit, but they're using cheap capacitors or whatever else they're using that means it won't last for 50 years like ones did 50 years ago. How much can you force manufacturers to, like, how long should they have to build something to physically
How
last?
much did it last? Some of
Yeah.
this comes down to the design process, where companies make choices about not just the quality of what they put into a product, but also how easy is it to take one component in or out.
Mm.
And there are some brands in the market who do really well at this. Something I was surprised about when we were pulling together our data for this process. one of the products that are most likely categories that are most likely to have a product breakage, stick vacs. But everyone who's had a broken stick vac was telling us, no, we had a great time. It was fine. Everything was fixed. It's because large companies, particularly Dyson, have designed their products to have components pop in and out, and their customer service is really well geared towards just being like, need an extra part? We will send it your way. So there are those kind of the behaviors we want to encourage businesses to think about. Um, and I think that's where a product labeling and repairability, durability information at the point of sale can encourage that, because at least you'll see the brands that are doing better on that front. And if it matters to you, you can make the choice.
On that repairability front, one of the recommendations that I saw, which I thought was really quite exciting, really interesting, was the recommendation that people should be able to use third party parts without necessarily voiding their warranties, because this has been such a huge thing, especially again in smartphones. Apple's the classic for it with Touch ID sensors and them saying, right, no, that's not one of ours. So your phone is blocked or it can't use these features. That would, again, with the dangling if, not be a thing anymore.
That's it. And like the other bad practice we saw was warranty void stickers. You particularly saw it on gaming consoles.
Mm.
Companies that had this big sticker on their product saying, if you crack this open and it's not official, your warranty is void. And what it doesn't say is that your consumer law exists outside of the manufacturer's warranty. So they're being really, I think, misleading by omission there. But it puts a dampener on people getting help when something goes wrong. And yeah, this recommendation would really nicely deal with that.
So there's also a mention in there of consumers being able to be part of a super complaint. Is this where we all wear our underwear on the outside and fly to the law courts, or how does this work?
It's, I guess, where I wear my underwear on the outside for consumers is probably the way to think about it.
And you think there'd be complaints about that?
There probably would be,
There
and
would be
rightly so.
complaints if I did this. I'm sure of it.
So this is a power that they have in the United Kingdom. And essentially it's the ability for registered not-for-profit consumer organizations to be able to lodge complaints with a regulator, have them taken really seriously, and have a response in a set time frame. So it's a mechanism to kind of gather that community sentiment around a problem and get it dealt with quickly. In the UK, it's helped deal with things like the loyalty penalty, businesses that charge the people who stay the longest the most, and often that's really
Foxtel, I'm looking at you.
yeah, there's some classics in Australia. But it's forced regulators to find really creative solutions to this and grapple with the issues. And I think it's a great way to make sure the voice of the consumer is actually heard.
So I don't understand the technicalities of it, but it sounds like the equivalent of a class action in the US. Is it the same thing or is it different?
It wouldn't go through the court. So basically, a group like Choice would write a very serious report using evidence from consumers, take it to a body like the ACCC, and say, this is a super complaint. You have to tell us what you're going to do about this issue, typically within a 90-day period. So it brings a time pressure to it as well and escalates that issue.
Yeah.
So you mentioned we keep bouncing around the dangling if here. What's the actual next step in terms of this report? Where does this go?
So all of these recommendations largely sit with the federal government. There are a few things in here that maybe the ACCC could progress to a degree on their own, although even things like there's a recommendation for the ACCC to undertake a market study into the mobile phone and tablet market and repair issues. Great idea. The Treasurer has to initiate that. And other ideas, they either need federal budget funding or federal government to legislate. All feasible, but I think with the federal election coming up, I wouldn't expect action until at least middle of 2022.
Do you think there's enough of a mainstream push around this? Is this maybe not an election issue, but is this a big enough issue that you could see politicians thinking, yeah, we need to do something about this?
The frustrations are real, and we've got survey data showing like this is one of those real bugbears. People hate it when something they've bought, like a washing machine, dies in 3 years and they just can't get any reasonable practical help. And enough of us have experienced this and want to do the right thing and not just throw the thing out on the street for money and environmental reasons. That I think this is a political no-brainer. It's about sustainability and cost of living. But I think there's going to have to be a piece of work to demonstrate how important that is. So consumers are going to have to do their bit to ask MPs and senators to act, and groups like Choice are going to have to take on the case.
So you mentioned earlier on that the report took on an awful lot of what Choice was looking to get out of a right to repair. Was there anything that you wanted that you didn't get?
One thing that I would have, and we've talked about it. The consumer guarantees are fuzzy, very deliberately so. So your right to repair, for example, it's dependent on a product has to last for a reasonable period, and what that reasonable period isn't pinned down. And we were saying, we actually need some guidance here. We need the regulator to say, if you paid X dollars for a mobile phone, it should last for X years. They didn't go down that path. Instead, they've suggested ways to make the consumer law more usable through state-based regulatory mechanisms, and that's good. We wanted to see that, but I still think it's really hard for people to figure out if they need to make a complaint until we have that clarity with the law.
Can that work against people though? Because if you bought a cheap and nasty piece of junk, then you brought it on yourself.
I think it can work against. So right now, the law is fuzzy, and if you're a really good self advocate, you could make the case. If you felt compelled enough, you could go to a tribunal, you could really push it. But those are people who've usually got a fair amount of power in the market anyway. A clarity is most likely to help people who aren't confident in their rights, don't feel confident making a complaint, or don't have the same level of knowledge about the consumer law and how to navigate really tricky complaint processes sometimes.
I would have thought the other issue, and it's a potential issue, it's not an absolute, specifically within tech, is the pace of
Change.
technology and the pace of change. If you say, right, a smartphone has to last 3 years, if you to throw a number out there, but suddenly, we're suddenly getting better glass or we're getting better plastic or whatever, then maybe that becomes less relevant. Or indeed, if they're giving away smartphones in cereal boxes, let's face it, it's a matter of time,
Oh, no.
then then maybe those ones, shouldn't last as long. How much of an issue do you think that is?
Look, that's actually one of the discussions the ACCC wanted to have around this. In the draft report, there was this recommendation, and the ACCC, like, guys, it's a lot of work. We thought about it, and actually, Choice has put out some guidance on this, on what we think at a really, really high level. So, a washing machine in this price range should last these years. We think we still need that level down guidance, and it can be done. It's just not easy work.
Okay, well, it feels almost inevitable that within the next couple of months we'll probably have you back to discuss the next step of wherever this pursues to. But thanks so much for your time today, Erin.
Thank you for having me.
You've been a guest on the show a number of times. You know what you're about to face. The vertical hold 3 questions of doom. I'll ask all 3 of them in order, and then you can answer in any order you like. So, where can people find your work online? Where can they find your social media online? And our contentious question of the moment, given that scientists have taught rats how to play Doom via VR, what classic or modern video game should they teach rats to play next?
Oh, Untitled Goose Game. Because I want to know how evil the rats really are. And
All these
choice,
scientists are like, damn, why didn't I think of that?
it's the best game
I
that's been
think you just
released in
got
I'm
years.
yourself
not
a
sure we
funding
need
grant.
more evil rats, Erin. I'm just not sure.
I think you just got yourself a funding grant right there.
I'm not running this. I almost don't. I don't want to oversee the evil rats, but I feel like we all need to know.
Hmm.
Anyway, choice.com.au and Erin L. Turner on Twitter for all things consumer and Goose Game related. It's my favorite.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time.
So, Alex, there's been a lot of talk about smart cars, and we talked about autonomous cars a couple of weeks ago. But now we're talking about cars that can tell when you've had a few too many and will take away the keys. What's the story here?
So, this is a bit of US legislation, which has actually passed into law. This will be a thing where US President Joe Biden has put a bill forward which basically calls for passive monitoring systems in new cars that will detect if you're over the legal limit for blood alcohol and either stop you being able to start the car or stop the car from being in operation if you are already driving. It won't come in for a couple of years. They've got to work out what the standards are going to be, but it is coming. And because it's going to come to the US, inevitably it's going to spread pretty much everywhere because big tech always works this way. The bigger markets determine what smaller markets like Australia actually get.
So, Dr. Nick, do you think that this is the kind of tech that would work? How would they make it work?
Well, this is what's really interesting to me because I was surprised to learn that this was coming into effect, that this was going to be a law, because I feel like there's elements of it that seem to be based on technology that doesn't exist yet, or at least not technology I'm completely familiar with. I mean, my understanding is we're talking about ideas that your breath alone could be detected in the car about whether it has alcohol above the legal driving limit, but the car would know if that's you in the driving seat versus someone who's in the passenger seat. The idea that somehow when you press the ignition, it might be able to detect the alcohol in your bloodstream using a kind of the similar kind of detection technique that a smart Fitbit uses to work out your pulse. I mean, all of this sounds to me more like tech bros spitballing some cool ideas than anything that's actually able to be done. And so I was genuinely shocked.
Because they have locks that they can put on cars. I don't know if they're in Australia, but in some places. But that's if you've had like a drink driving offence, and you have to basically there's a little breathalyzer built into the ignition. But they're not going to inflict that on everybody, are they? That you actually have to blow
No.
into this bag. Like that would seem like you're treating everybody like a criminal.
Well, that's an interesting one because, I mean, to me, that's a really simple one. It's the active way of
Yeah.
testing for this. But part of it is they are looking for this to be a passive detection. And I think they're hoping it to be a passive detection because it won't slow down how easy it is to get around some of these things. I mean, I think
'Cause
we've all
sometimes you're
seen.
in a rush to get to the bottle shop. You don't want to be slowed
Yeah.
down by the breathalyzer.
And I think,
Closes in 5 minutes.
as funny as that is, I think we should really point out that drunk driving itself is a bad thing. We are not advocating for
Oh,
people
for
getting
sure.
behind the wheel while plastered.
Yeah.
It's not entirely a laughing matter. And I think that's why passive, well, you're right, Nick, the tech is weird, but passive makes sense to me in that logical way of saying, look, if you're going to measure this, you've got to do this on an ongoing and
Mm.
unobtrusive way. You can't kind of say to the driver, every 3 minutes, duck your head forward and blow into this tube, or the car's going to stop.
No, I think you're right. And it has to be pervasive. And in a very real way, for this to be genuinely effective, it kind of has to be invisible. This needs to be part of you are just hopping in the car, you're not changing your behavior. The car's reacting to the way, you are pumping out alcohol molecules to a large degree. The minute it is blow into this to unlock your car, it's going to be easy to find a way around it.
But also there'd be a huge pushback against that as well. I don't think, especially Americans, where they're very much about their rights, and people are already complaining that this is unconstitutional. I don't remember drink driving existing when they wrote the Constitution. Don't get on
Drink
your horse when you've
chariot
had
driving.
yeah, exactly. Don't get on your horse when you've had too many. But yeah, so there will be a pushback from um, rights advocates, I suppose.
There
So you've
always
got to
will
make
be.
sure there always will be, but you don't want to play into their hands by making it too intrusive.
Look, yes and no. I mean, don't forget that in the early days of seatbelts, oh no, that's
Oh,
just
that was a
changed
big
everything. I
fight.
can't
Yeah,
drive with one of these on. They're dangerous. I can't look
yeah.
over my shoulder the way I used to. No matter what safety regulations come in, someone is going to say, it's my God given right to choke on a packet of silica gel if that's what I want. Someone
Yeah.
is going to say that this will infringe on my rights. I am a firm believer, genuinely, in bigger government. I think government exists in a large way, or should exist, to protect people from their baser or more naive instincts. And that does include rules around drink driving.
And the seatbelt one's an interesting one. I mean, in researching around this, I hit the point that in the States, in the 70s, when they were putting seatbelt laws in, some jurisdictions actually said you've got to have smart systems in the car that can detect that people are clipped in. And those exist in the cars we've got now. If you chuck a bag on your passenger seat these days and you head off on a drive, quite often it'll start beeping at you to say, hey, your passenger doesn't have their seatbelt done up, and it's not a
Which
passenger
is
at
really
all.
weird when you're in a hire car and you've never owned a car like that before.
Totally. Oh yeah, totally. First time it always crabs you, but
Yeah.
but the systems they had back in the 70s were worse. They were more primitive, of course, because the tech was more primitive, and it led to genuine issues where people were properly clipped in. They were trying to do the right thing, and the car wouldn't go because it said no, you're breaking the rules. That false positives strikes me as such a big problem area. I mean, what happens if I've splashed on too much cologne, or the guy in the back seat spilled a bottle of beer, let alone whether or not I'm actually drunk myself?
That is some of the big questions I've got. Because if you are doing the right thing, if you're playing designated driver, and if it is one of these passive breath detection systems, how on earth can it tell that it's just you? And I understand there's some ways around it, but there has to be a potential for significant false positives here. I would love to see drink driving eradicated. It is not,
Mm.
it's one of those situations where if you were only harming yourself, I'd say have at, but you don't. Statistically, you harm the people around you. You don't just harm yourself. Um,
Someone's got to attend to your crash, frankly, so you never harm nobody.
yeah,
Mm.
that's a really good point as well. There will always be some impact on it. But, this has to be, it is a scourge. It needs to be treated seriously. We need to do what we can to eliminate it. But I do worry about the false positives. I genuinely do.
I'll be interested to see if there's pushback from car makers. Now, apparently, one of the systems they're talking about using has been in development for 10 years with car makers. And so that's interesting that car makers are on board because the big question here is liability. And it's very similar to the conversations we had about autonomous cars a couple of weeks ago. If this technology doesn't do its job properly and somebody gets hurt, who is responsible? The driver, the maker of the car, the maker of the system that was supposed to stop them driving. All of that needs to be sorted out before this can work.
Especially in a highly litigious society like the United States.
Especially, yes. But then each country will have its own different laws, so it's going to have to try and fit in other places as well. It'll be interesting to see what the European Union does. They're usually a big. I'm actually surprised they didn't do it first because they usually go first on all this kind of stuff. So I'll be interested to see whether or not they follow, and if they do it the same way.
There is a 3-year period for the standards to actually be developed.
Yeah.
And I guess that is also to help with dealing with how you're going to deal with all of those issues. Although there is another standard which could actually bite some Australian car buyers. If you're a big fan of, American muscle cars, for example, and there's certainly a few of those about, and you thought, hey, I'm going to import one of these cars, and what's more, it's going to keep me safe because it's going to have this tech, years before they hit Australian cars because of the differences in the way US law works for actual drunk driving. Their drunk driving legal limit is 30% higher than it is in Australia.
Oh,
So what? 0.08.
0.08. Wow.
0.08 in almost
As an
all of the
Australian, that
US.
sounds like a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, in Australia it's 0.05. And
Yeah.
the point there, of course, being you could get behind the wheel, you think, oh, I'm all right to drive. You're 0.06, your car says, yeah, you're fine, buddy. But of course, you're actually not.
Yeah.
Not at all.
I think you'll find that they will disable it overseas. It's just like the autonomous features in cars, and the car manufacturers will only turn it on in certain markets. And if the laws don't align with what they need, they just, when they sell it in that market, they switch it off. I think if those cars come to Australia, this feature will be switched off until it is in alignment with our laws and designed to work here.
Will it add to the cost of the car, though? We're already seeing a situation where cars are about as expensive as it has been. I hate to say it because I'm sure you've been talking about it so much. Supply chain issues
Yes.
have meant that, secondhand cars are more expensive than ever before. What people are going to get angry about is if this is adding to the cost of something, of a car when it's not even being used in the country they intend to drive.
Well, I think hopefully, because we are talking that 3-year period where they're going to work out what the rules and regs mean, and then a year or two before those models actually hit the market in the States, hopefully we'll be past the worst of those supply chain issues. And with a bit of luck, that should converge pretty nicely with where we'll see EVs dropping in price as well, because we continually keep kind of sitting and waiting for that cheap Tesla. Sorry, Adam, not the Cybertruck, but those cheap
Damn.
EVs to start arriving. That should start happening towards the middle of this decade. Although, again, here in Australia, we will be a few more years behind that because there's just not been as heavy a push on that. But I'd imagine that a lot, if not all, of the vehicles that actually have this tech on board would also be EVs.
It's probably very likely, and it does seem like a natural fit in a weird way. I was just quickly looking. The average worldwide is 0.06, so Australia is actually under the average.
Nice work, Australian legislators.
Mm.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Emily and Erin for joining us for this week's show, and thanks, of course, to Nick.
It was great to be able to be back. It's been a lot of fun.
Now, Nick, I don't think you've been a guest on the show for a little while. Now is the time for you to face the Vertical Hold 3 questions of doom. I will ask you all 3, and you can answer in any order you like.
Hit me.
Where can people find your work?
ABC.
Where can they find you on social media? And the big contentious question, Given that scientists have taught rats how to play Doom via VR, what's the next video game, classic or not, that they should be trained to play next?
No, and the fourth question, can I listen to the initial instructions before diving in, of course? And the answer to that one was no. You can hear me on ABC Western Plains. I do the breakfast show. You can catch up with that on the ABC Listen app is probably the best way to find me if you're not in the Western Plains region. At Dr. Nick on social media, DR_NIC. Just a warning, it's pretty much nothing but cat photos these days. And I reckon Tetris, because I would like to see rats stack. Stacks of rats having a good time.
Rat-based Tetris. Excellent. And I don't see a problem, by the way, with Twitter being full of cat photos. I'm 100% behind that. And if Adam will give me the keys, the Vertical Hold Twitter account, which you can find at Vertical Hold AU, will be nothing but cat pictures, as will the Vertical Hold Facebook page and possibly the website, which you can find at verticalhold.com.au.
And just a reminder for regular listeners, we're thrilled to have Aussie Broadband as our sponsor, and they've given us a special promo code which gives new customers a $10 per month discount for 6 months when signing up online for an unlimited plan between NBN 50 and NBN 100. The promo code is vertical, so hopefully that'll come in handy for Australian listeners shopping around for a great broadband service. And as always, thanks everyone for listening. Don't forget to tell your friends about us, leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice, and help us spread the good word. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.
It's sure glad that I made it really, really clear that I've never been on dating apps before you guys had my wife as a guest.